Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from those written by Jane Austen to Shakespeare's works and everything in between for the last 2,500 years, that you might have fallen asleep to reading when you were trying to read them back in high school. We do this for our audience, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or even the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern West we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 96. As I said before, we're creeping up chronologically on episode number 100. Today, we will be talking about a collection of polemical essays designed to document the trials and travails of a black intellectual during the racial roil of the 1950s and the 1960s, the classic mid-century American problem. After their publication, these essays influenced writers from Joan Didion to Toni Morrison and everyone in between. Now, this writer was a public intellectual. He even debated William F. Buckley and was minted in an era when the term public intellectual had actual heft, weight, and meaning. Dare I say, gravitas. And he lived every inch of the life of a public intellectual. Today on the podcast, we will be summarizing and contextualizing and analyzing and examining the collected work of the writer and activist James Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son. Leaders, please remember your highest calling. Picking up from the titular essay in Notes of a Native Son, we are going to open up today on our podcast with the essay Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin. Now, again, we're attempting a little bit of a different format here for a whole variety of reasons. Kind of going a little bit more in the literary critic or literary criticism direction rather than the straight read from the book direction. Now, you can get collections, you can get the collection, or you can get individual versions of these essays online. And so today we will read a couple of clips from Notes of a Native Son and other essays that are in our collection. But we will not be fully focusing on reading directly from the essay as we think and contextualize these thoughts from James Baldwin. So from Notes of a Native Son, it of course opens up like this. On the 29th of July in 1943, my father died. On the same day, a few hours later, his last child was born. Over a month before this, while all our energies were concentrated in waiting for these events, there had been in Detroit one of the bloodiest race riots of the century. A few hours after my father's funeral, while he lay in state in the Undertaker's Chapel, a race riot broke out in Harlem. On the morning of the 3rd of August, we drove my father to the graveyard through a wilderness of smashed plate glass. So this opens up Notes of a Native Son. The essay, or an essay, in which Baldwin, as the author, at an arm's length, right, describes his relationship with his father, a man who was beaten into bitterness and hard bondage through the impacts of racism and ignorance. A man who complicated his relationship with a young James Baldwin by the fact of religion, by the fact of being a Christian preacher, or Baptist preacher, actually, and not really understanding how to effectively put across the power of Christianity to a young James Baldwin, although Baldwin would eventually, in subsequent later years, even with his own identity troubles, and we'll talk a little bit about those today on the podcast, he would eventually acknowledge the power and the impact of Christianity in his life. His father also, and it was really his stepfather actually, couldn't resolve, and this is something else that you see in the essay, Notes of a Native Son, he couldn't resolve the tension between the justice of the world beyond and the injustice in his time, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, of the world right here and right now. At the end of the essay, Baldwin comes to the conclusion that his father's death has allowed him to gain the beginning of catharsis between the bitterness of undelivered justice and the acceptance of the tragedies of human nature. As a matter of fact, he closes this long essay, which is divided up into three parts. He ends this essay on this note, and I quote, "But as for me and my house, my father had said, we will serve the Lord." I wondered as we drove him to his resting place what this line had meant for him. I had heard him preach it many times. I preached it once myself, proudly giving it an interpretation different from my father's. Now the whole thing came back to me as though my father and I were on our way to Sunday school and I were memorizing the golden text. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I suspected in these familiar lines a meaning which had never been there for me before. All of my father's texts and songs, which I had decided were meaningless, were arranged before me at his death like empty bottles, waiting to hold the meaning which life would give them for me. This was his legacy. Nothing is ever escaped. That bleakly memorable morning, I hated the unbelievable streets and the Negroes and whites who had equally made them that way, but I knew that it was folly, as my father would have said. This bitterness was folly. It was necessary to hold on to the things that mattered. The dead man mattered. The new life mattered. Blackness and whiteness did not matter. To believe that they did was to acquiesce in one's own destruction. Hatred, which could destroy so much, never failed to destroy the man who hated, and this was an immutable law. James Arthur Baldwin, born August 2nd, 1924. He died December 1st, 1987, was a Black American novelist, playwright, essayist, and poet. His first novel, Go and Tell It on the Mountain, was published in 1953 to almost universal critical acclaim. And just like Pablo Picasso in the visual arts, during his long literary career, James Baldwin never really suffered from critical rejection. As a matter of fact, Baldwin, out of all three of the Black intellectual writers we've read so far on the podcast this month, including Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright, He never really suffered, like I said, critical rejection. White critics liked him, and black critics, even later into his years of writing and of being a public intellectual, still acknowledged and were in deference to his his literary talent. Now, his first essay collection that we are examining today, Notes of a Native Son, was published in 1955, and he was urged to do it even though at the time he said he wasn't quite ready to write his memoirs. He'd only published Go Tell It on the Mountain a couple of years before that, and he wasn't really ready. Like I said, he pushed back a little bit on the offer to write Notes of a Native Son, but eventually he took it up, and it became a collection not of a memoir, not documenting a memoir of a man's life, but it became a collection of his observations on what it meant to be black in America during a time of social change, right? Now, Baldwin became a well-known scion, partially as a result of Notes of a Native Son, but also because of his other literary work. And he wrote for magazines, he wrote essays, he wrote critical commentaries. We're going to talk about all of those today. But Baldwin became a well-known scion of the 60s and 70s protest movements in America. And his presence on the public scene, both in America and in Europe, served as a powerful totemic writer for both the gay liberation movement, which may come as a surprise to some of us, and the African American civil rights movement. So I'm just going to get this out of the way early. Yes, James Baldwin was a homosexual. Yes, he did have a multiple years long relationships with men, mostly in Europe, Switzerland, France, and England. But he was engaged in that practice, and it did inform some of his writing and the themes of some of his writing. But he was also black, and he was also an American, and so he was a unique public intellectual who wrote publicly about his sexual identity and his sexual proclivities, but he also had the tension that went along with that with race. By the way, that's something that's often not talked about in the black community. Being black and being gay, even now, is a truly, to paraphrase from Malcolm X, a truly revolutionary act. And Baldwin lived right at the intersection of all of that revolution. Now, in his personal life, Baldwin was personal friends, or an enemy of, or ambivalent about, almost all the other major black writers, actors, activists, and intellectuals of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, from Richard Wright, who encouraged him to write, all the way to his political friend, as he put it, Malcolm X. Literary critic Harold Bloom characterized James Baldwin as, quote, among the most considerable moral essayists in the United States, close quote. And Baldwin, I won't say he chafed underneath that consideration, but I do not believe that that was his primary concern with his writing. Often, African Americans, particularly during the Civil Rights Movement and as a result of the Civil Rights Movement, and this has only begun to wane recently, were tagged with being the quote-unquote, or serving as quote-unquote, the conscience of America. I think Baldwin struggled against that idea because, like Ralph Waldo Ellison before him, he merely sought to write to engage and even to have his identity shaped, not at the intersection of all of these identities, but to have all of his identities come together and to have him acknowledged as an individual human being. And that's one of the big things we can take from Baldwin's writing. Ralph Ellison firmly staked out the landscape of being viewed as a humanist, particularly in light of Invisible Man being published in the 1940s, and then never publishing another novel again. But Baldwin was a prolific writer. He could never shut up. And he would always go and talk to a camera or talk into a microphone. And so he was a prolific writer, a prolific talker, and I think he used the tools laid out before him to work out ideas that he had in his brain in public, which is kind of what a public intellectual does. But he also used these tools that were in front of him, the typewriter, the camera, and, of course, the microphone, to stir people to action. But to stir people to action as individuals rather than a group. And this tension, the tension between what the group needed, the group being African Americans in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in the United States of America, and the tension between there and what James Baldwin wanted as an individual at the intersection of all of his identities, was something that I think Baldwin struggled with. And I think that Baldwin is a unique author for us to read and consider as leaders, because we all struggle with that tension even more sharply in the atomized world we live in today. Back to the book, back to Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin. So we're going to pick up with his review of a film from 1955. And this is a review that he wrote in the magazine Commentary. Originally, the review was titled Life Straightened DI. DEI, right? Or DEI, such as it were in the patois of Harlem. And Baldwin rejiggered this review, and he retitled it for Notes of a Native Son, Carmen Jones, The Dark is Light Enough. And so one of the interesting things about this particular essay is it's short, so there's not a lot here. But there is a lot here in terms of examining the distinct challenges in the 1950s of representing black men and women on screen in a way that showed them not as stereotypes, but as people. And as a matter of fact, Baldwin points this out right up front in his essay. And so I quote, Hollywood's peculiar ability to milk, so to speak, the cow and the goat at the same time, and then to peddle the results as ginger ale, has seldom produced anything more arresting than the 1955 production of Carmen Jones. In Hollywood, for example, immorality and evil, which are synonyms in that lexicon, are always vividly punished, though it is the way of the transgressor, hard perhaps, but far from unattractive, which keeps us on the edge of our seats, and the transgressor, himself or herself, who engages all our sympathy. Similarly, in Carmen Jones, the implicit parallel between an amoral gypsy and an amoral Negro woman is the entire root idea of the show. But at the same time, bearing in mind the distances covered since the birth of a nation, it is important that the movie always be able to repudiate any suggestion that Negroes are amoral, which it can only do considering the role of the Negro in the national psyche, by repudiating any suggestion that Negroes are not white. Close quote. And then away we go. And Baldwin points out in Carmen Jones, The Dark is Light Enough, that Hollywood is caught in a contextual and narrative vice. And he mentions, of course, right at the beginning there, that amorality. But the other dynamic there is, and he knows this as a person who is an astute observer of political, social, and moral culture in America in the 1950s and in the 1940s, and off into the future in the 60s and 70s, he would note that Hollywood has to appeal to white audiences, right? Because fundamentally, at the end of the day, there just aren't enough black people in Harlem, Detroit, in Watts, in New Orleans, in Dallas, in Minneapolis, in Chicago. There just aren't enough black people to buy tickets to go see a movie about black people. Baldwin, in his review, is not convinced by the end of the essay that that 20th Century Fox, who I believe was the one who yes, it was 20th Century Fox who produced and bankrolled Carmen Jones. He's not convinced that 20th Century Fox stuck the landing, and he believes that fundamentally this is because all Americans, but in particular white Americans, are deeply disturbed about race. Reading Carmen Jones' The Dark is Light Enough is like stepping into a time machine and going backward past a whole lot of detritus to a place that very few of us now postmodern folks, black and white and Asian and Hispanic and folks from everywhere else in a multi-ethnic, multiracial America would recognize. So what are we to make of this essay about Carmen Jones as leaders? What are we to take from this? What's the leadership value in a review of a movie from over, let's see, 1955? That would be 45, 50, 70, 75 years ago, right? A 75-year-old film, right? What are we to take from a review of a 75-year-old film? By the way, that was the sound of me doing some mental math there. Well, I think the biggest thing that we can take from James Baldwin's review of Carmen Jones in Notes of a Native Son is this idea that the tension between individual identity and being seen as an individual versus the desires of the collective around uniformity and unity and group solidarity really are tensions that Baldwin was wrestling with early in his life and continue to wrestle with throughout the remainder of his life. As I said before, previously, look, leaders are always going to have these types of tensions, right? And it's really interesting because the tensions that Baldwin defines even existed during a time period that we look back on 75 years away from it in history as a time when there was no tension. One of the myths of the 1950s is that everyone was on the same page. There was conformity, right? That's the myth. Sure, there were beatniks. Sure, there were folks who were outside of the pale of society, the proto-hippies, right? The Jack Kerouacs and the other folks that hung around with Kerouac. I can't think of all of them right now, although we did read Jack Kerouac's travel log last year on the podcast. You should go check out that episode. But yeah, sure, those folks were on the fringes of society, and sure, you had your dope heads, and you had folks who maybe didn't want to go along. The folks that shows like Dragnet would talk about and encourage kids to report on, to narc on, and to be good citizens. And of course, in the 1950s, the way we remember it anyway, whether we are politically left or politically right, we remember everybody being upset about communists and seeing communists under their bed. As my guest co-host Tom Libby would say, turns out that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And then he would laugh, and he would be right to laugh. That brings a chuckle to my mind even now. Well, what has happened, though, over the course of the last 75 years, though, is that while our conceptions of the 1950s have not updated, they really haven't updated in the ways in which we think about how they were atomized by their own time then. See, we seem to think that atomization due to technology, due to different social mores and social norms is something new. But the reality is, if we went back to the 1940s and 1950s in America, that atomization was happening among all racial groups, white, black, Asian, Hispanic. That atomization of individuals was happening. It just may not have been talked about as loudly or as publicly as it is currently talked about in our loudly nonconformist era. Movies like Carmen Jones did eventually lead to something else. And it's interesting, once I read this essay, I went and I looked up Carmen Jones. By the way, you can find it on Amazon. You can rent it for $3.79 if you have an Amazon Prime account. And so I watched the trailer for Carmen Jones. And as I was watching the trailer for it, the first thought that came to me was, this film is a little too on the nose. They're trying a little bit too hard. Now, I get it. They were trying to represent African Americans, represent black people in a gracious and in a wonderful and in a lovely manner. I mean, this was a movie that starred Dorothy Dandridge, right, and also had as Carmen, but then also had and even Baldwin mentions it. Let's see, I'm going to look it up here. What's his name? Harry Belafonte. Yes, Mr. Deo himself, right? So Harry Belafonte and Dorothy Dandridge, who were the two most socially acceptable black actors and actresses of their time. By the way, socially acceptable to white audiences and black audiences alike. And you just watch the trailer for this movie, and you begin to realize that it was a little too on the nose. Now, maybe that's because I have the benefit of 75 years of history that the folks who were at the time didn't have. And thinking about that 75 years of history, what can we take from Carmen Jones? Well, it stands as a relic, right? On one end, a relic of a time long past and racial politics and cultural politics that seem to be long dead. But then we have to think about the era we are in now. We live in an era where movies have been created, and particularly in the post-Carmen Jones era of the 70s and 80s, most films starring black actors of any type became protest films against a volume of racism, particularly white racism, that was actually precipitously beginning to decline. Even though the audiences, both black and white, who were going to see these films and take in this culture, knew what actual, real racism sounded like. By the way, just a side note, James Baldwin was a good friend, apparently, of Norman Mailer and his wife. Norman Mailer, who created more shows on television that subtly shifted racial cultural attitudes in America and reflected them back to Americans, along with Norman Lear, than probably any other two intellectual creatives, white intellectual creatives in the 20th century. By the way, those movies in the 70s and 80s that were those protest films, movies like Shaft, and then in the 90s, New Jack City, Boys in the Hood, these were all protest films, but they began a subtle shift, right? A shift away from focusing on racism, although that was still there as the core of most of African Americans' problems, to a shift to focusing on the issues of the ghetto, the issues of drugs, the issues of gang violence, the issues of unwed mothers, the issues of men incarcerated. 40 years later, in 2024, and whatever year you may be listening to this subsequently, culture, particularly American culture, has turned a corner where the separation between Spike Lee, whose most recent film, I believe, was Black KKK Klansman, or Black Klansman, as you would pronounce it. The separation between Spike Lee and Antoine Fuqua, who directed Equalizer 3, couldn't be more stark and obvious to anyone with eyes to see, even though they both share the same degree of melanin in their skin tone. Part of this has been driven, of course, in Hollywood, and Baldwin would note this as well, by the internationalization of film audiences. Now, Hollywood doesn't just have to sell movies. It doesn't just have to sell culture to people in America. It has to sell culture to people in China, and to people in South America, and to people in Southwest Asia, and to people in Africa. People who want to see, well, they want to see all different types of representation, not just have American culture shoved down their throat. Which means racial grievance narratives or racial whitewashing attempts just don't sell tickets. That kind of stuff doesn't move units. It doesn't create four-quadrant films, which, by the way, is why superhero movies have eaten the box office for the last 25 years almost, warping everything. Look, leaders, the thing you need to take from Carmen Jones and the review of Carmen Jones by James Baldwin in Notes of a Native Son is this. This is the big thing to take. The protest film narrative is dead. No matter how many times you see police officer body camera footage of a quote-unquote unjust traffic stop. And it's dead not just because we can see things in real time now. It's dead because it's sell-by date to audiences that have different cultural backgrounds with different problems is past. Back to the book, back to Notes of a Native Son. So we're going to turn the corner here, and we're going to talk about one of the titular essays in Notes of a Native Son. Matter of fact, it's the essay that kicks off the book. It is entitled Everybody's Protest Novel. Inside of this essay, and this is a very unique one, and this is why I think Baldwin began with it, because he was, and we'll see this later, he was trying to work something out. But Baldwin lays out an idea here, and he starts off right away in laying the idea out in the first few paragraphs of Everybody's Protest Novel. And so I'm going to... I was going to quote directly from it, but I think it would be better to sort of summarize and bring a couple of ideas to the forefront that that Baldwin is trying to work out in the actual essay itself. So his core idea here is that America's novels, America's writing, certain types of American writing that are supposed to be good for people to read, right? Like medicine you're supposed to take, are really bad art. And they're bad for a number of different reasons. But he believes fundamentally that protest novels that are designed to gin up our distress or to create confusion, or that are designed to be self-righteous and hot, that are designed to create terror in folks, or that are designed to get us to overthrow a certain type of government or a certain type of societal structure. Baldwin believes that these kinds of novels are fundamentally just bad. By the way, he starts off by laying into Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, the novel that even Abraham Lincoln credited with kicking off, or being one of the elements that kicked off the American Civil War. And then he also lays into the character of Bigger Thomas in Everybody's Protest novel, the character, of course, that was made famous by Native Son by Richard Wright. So he's striking at Richard Wright's ability to, write, but he's also striking at Harriet Beecher Stowe's ability to, write in Everybody's Protest novel in this essay. And Baldwin believes that, or he holds, that protest novels are designed to be polemical screeds rather than actual novels with artistic writing about real people. He believes that the kinds of people that are in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the types of characters that are created, both black and white, and the types of characters that Richard Wright created in Native Son, in Bigger Thomas, and all of the characters that surrounded Bigger weren't actual people. They were merely avatars. They were merely ciphers upon which other aspects of our country's problems were laid. Now, Baldwin doesn't go nearly as far as I would have gone. I think he kind of pulls back a little bit. But Baldwin doesn't hold to the idea that such protest novels are, in essence, propaganda. He never actually says that. But he does show, or he does sort of wander up to the idea that if they're not exactly propaganda, novels, particularly in a time of mass reading and mass literacy, novels will perform the service of propagandizing the reader until real, genuine propaganda actually shows up. Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us, that's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show. Only in a country that enshrined freedom of speech in its founding documents could the protest novel turn from serviceable art to barely palatable propaganda. In Baldwin's 1949 essay, I'm going to quote from Wikipedia here. In Baldwin's 1949 essay, Everybody's Protest novel, however, he indicated that Native Son, like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, lacked credible characters and psychological complexity, and the friendship between the two authors, and by the way, the two authors were Baldwin and Richard Wright, ended. Interviewed by Julius Lester in 1984, however, Baldwin explained, quote, "I knew Richard and I loved him. I was not attacking him. I was trying to clarify something for myself." Close quote. By the way, that is from the Wikipedia entry on James Baldwin. I agree. He was trying to work out something for himself. He was trying to work out something for himself at the intersection of his art, his identity, and what it means to be an American in a world, or maybe not in a world, but in America where you can, in essence, say anything you want, but the state may not be able to hand out a consequence, but the market or your fellow man absolutely can. The thing that Baldwin, I think, was trying to clarify for himself is the thing that many black Americans and others have only begun to clear up for themselves with the help of atomizing and the bond-dissolving forces of the internet and social media. We are not, and we never have been, unified in one block of thinking, acting, being, or doing. Instead, for many black people, the black minority, just like the white majority, and just like other groups who have become legally enfranchised across the identity spectrum, we have become, at long last, through atomization and dissolution, merely another version of individual Americans. This is why books like the ones that Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, or Ibram X. Kendi, or Robin DiAngelo, they may work for a little while. They may serve to move a few units to a very narrow crowd on the Upper East Side of New York City. But out here, in the hinterland, where you and I live, that crap doesn't wash. The reason why is because protest novels or protest screeds or protest literature has a limited, just like Carmen Jones, has a limited sell-by date. And when the culture moves on, when things change, well, guess what? What you said doesn't really matter. Sure, we can read Uncle Tom's Cabin as a relic of a past time and wonder at it. We can even read Native Son, as we did on the podcast recently, and we can examine it and we can look at it as an artifact of a different era. But what are we doing now? How is art serving us now? And is the protest novel art? Like I said, Baldwin didn't go nearly as far as I would have, particularly in light in 2024 of the collapse of what was nominally a civil rights movement in America for black Americans. There's another idea that Baldwin is tackling in his essay, Everybody's Protest Novel, that opens up Notes of a Native Son. And it is this idea: I am not your protest object. My identity, whether it's black or homosexual, whether it's white or Christian, whether it's female or bisexual, whether it's rich or poor, whether it's Hispanic or Asian, whether it's Christian or Muslim, whether it's Hindu or Buddhist, and everything else in between, whether it's even vegan or meat eating. My identity is not your protest object. This is something crucial for us to get our arms around here at the end of the fourth turning. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about solutions today, because we are coming up to the end of the podcast today. And I do want to talk about solutions to some problems here that I see Baldwin raised. And I do think we have to explore what the possible get out of jail free cards are that Baldwin offers us in Notes of a Native Son. But the protests by Antifa and Black Lives Matter around the death of George Floyd, the narrative of black men killed indiscriminately by white police officers, Well, that narrative all fell apart once it was linked to defund the police and letting violent criminals back into the neighborhoods with no bail laws. The reason why it failed is because black people and white people, gay people and straight people, Christian people and non-Christian people, rich people and poor people, are at the end of the day not protest objects. They're not objects to be protested against. They're not even objects to be protested for. They're just people. They're individual people with individual needs and desires, motives, and emotions. Baldwin wanted to be treated like an individual. I am a man, right? Was the call in and during the civil rights movement against an entire way of speaking where black men were called boy, even when they were old men. I am not your protest object. I am not the object against which you can make an appeal, or for which you can, or for whom you can make an appeal. I'm an individual. Come get to know me as an individual. And leaders, that's your job. Your job is to lead people as individuals. Are those people going to be on a team? Yes. Are they going to be collapsed into a group? Yes. And this is the tension. You're going to have to figure out how to get to know them as individuals. And you're going to have to figure out how to lead them as a disparate, quarrelsome, and sometimes juxtaposed group. Back to the book, back to Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin. So we're going to close out our examination of this book by heading to an essay that he wrote in part 3 of the book. By the way, the essays in Notes of a Native Son are divided into 3 parts, part 1, part 2, and part 3. And so we're going to go to part 3. And this essay is titled Equal in Paris. And I quote, "On the 19th of December in 1949, when I had been living in Paris for a little over a year, I was arrested as a receiver of stolen goods and spent 8 days in prison. My arrest came about through an American tourist whom I had met twice in New York, who had been given my name and address and told to look me up. I was then living on the top floor of a ludicrously grim hotel on the Rue du Bac, one of those enormous, dark, cold, and hideous establishments in which Paris abounds that seem to breathe forth in their airless, humid, stone-cold halls the weak light, scurrying chambermaids, and creaking stairs, an odor of gentility long, long dead. The place was run by an ancient Frenchman dressed in an elegant black suit, which was green with age, who cannot properly be described as bewildered or even as being in a state of shock, since he had really stopped breathing around 1910. There he sat at his desk in the weirdly lit, fantastically furnished lobby day in and day out, greeting each one of his extremely impoverished and louche lodgers with a stately inclination of the head that he had no doubt been taught in some impossibly remote time was the proper way for a propriétaire to greet his guests. If it had not been for his daughter, an extremely hard-headed Stracotus, the inclination of her head was chilling and abrupt, like the downbeat of an axe. The hotel would certainly have gone bankrupt long before. It was said that this old man had not gone farther than the door of his hotel for 30 years, which was not at all difficult to believe. He looked as though the daylight would have killed him. And that's how that begins. And what we find out from Baldwin's experience in being arrested in 1949 and spending 8 days in prison in France is a few things, actually. So here was the initial charge. Baldwin was arrested by the French authorities for the supposed theft of some bed sheets from the aforementioned hotel. Right. Bed sheets. And in going through the French judicial process in the 1940s and in watching others as he sat in the dock waiting for his case to be heard, Baldwin realized that to his dismay and astonishment that the French didn't have any better of a handle on handling the injustices of handing out justice than the American judicial system, which he studiously tried to avoid as a black man in America, did. He was shocked by this revelation. Baldwin also discovered, again, much to his great surprise, and he lays this out fairly obtusely in Equal in Paris, but you can get it if you know how to read between the lines. Baldwin was greatly surprised to discover that his skin color was secondary in France to his nationality, particularly when it came to the finer points of escaping and evading French law. And the relief that he shared with all Americans in escaping and evading French law, regardless of their skin color, put him in a weird psychological space in 1949 and 1950 of being able to actually, for a brief moment, understand how white Americans view their existence in America. By the way, Baldwin wasn't ready for that, and, well, because he was working out all of the emotions of that, you get the essay, Equal in Paris. Remember I said we were going to talk about solutions to problems this year on the podcast? Well, we're going to talk about solutions to problems. So what solutions can we gain from understanding and appreciating Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin? Well, maybe the first thing that we can understand, and I've said this before in previous shorts episodes, but I'm going to say it here at the tail end of our much longer episode. The thing we can maybe understand is this: the triumph of the laws is almost complete. Look, the Civil Rights Law of 1968 basically said that people in private industry couldn't discriminate against people who, well, they normally would have discriminated against. It effectively ended free association, or if you want to look at it this way, it created government bureaucracy to police free association in the workplace. By the way, if you don't believe me, or if you don't want to buy that idea, if you think that that's a minority report on a civil rights law that was an unalloyed good in your mind, just think about how many incompetent people, regardless of race, have been hired due to the outgrowths of the civil rights laws of 1968 up to and including affirmative action. And think about how many of those incompetent people are now at elite institutions like Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Columbia, and will soon graduate and be making your life hell in an HR department near you. Okay, so we flattened everything, right? We allowed people to, or not allowed, we, at the force of law and, of course, police power, we forced people to integrate with each other. Now, looking back, we can say that maybe we could say that that was an unalloyed good, and maybe we should say that that's an unalloyed good. But whether it's good or bad or not is kind of irrelevant to the conversation. It did happen. We are not going to go backward. And so what were the knock-on effects of such of such legislation? That's the L word I'm looking for. Well, the knock-on effect of such legislation was that individual Black Americans had to become fundamentally individuals. They had to stand or fall on their own 2 feet, not in group solidarity, not paired with each other, but by themselves. Just as, from their perspective, white people, or white men, most notably, had done for the last name your number of hundreds of years here in Western culture. By the way, we can see evidence of this individualization starting from 1968 all the way to the late 1990s in everything from home ownership, the rates of home ownership among individual black people, and wealth creation among individual black people, all the way to the bad statistics around prison incarceration and poverty for individual black people. And so, the black minority, enabled to integrate fully with the white majority by force of law, now gets to experience all the failures and the successes that individuals in the majority endure. The real battle, I think, the real solution to the real problem for individual black Americans is for us as individual black Americans to get our heads around this. No longer does the group protect us. No longer is there such a thing as group solidarity. Battle is not to revisit calls for revolution once made in the past. I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of the folks who were protesting the death of George Floyd weren't actually black Americans. It was a lot of white people and a lot of women. So the real battle is not to revisit calls for revolution or even to create new revolutions. But instead, the real battle, and it's a battle that Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, 2 generations before us, and it's a battle that Ibrahim X. Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates can't fight right now. The real battle is to build a vision for the future for individual black Americans. And where there is no vision, the people perish, not as a collective group, but as individuals. Look, it's interesting to me that James Baldwin's father was a preacher, and Baldwin preached in the church himself and used that to work on his oratory skills. It's also interesting to me that Baldwin never repudiated Christianity. He merely struggled with it and struggled with his own sin, just like everybody else does. Well, the line that he mentioned at his father's death was from Joshua 24:15. And of course, the words in Joshua, written down by a man who had been a warrior and a visionary for his people, the second generation of his people, who were the sons and daughters of people who failed to enter the promised land and died ignobly in the wilderness outside of Canaan. This man led the sons and daughters of those people into the new promised land. And upon his death, he told them this: "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." That's from the book of Joshua, 24:15. All Americans as individuals need to decide that if serving the Lord seems undesirable to them, then they must choose for themselves this day whom they will serve. Whether they will serve the gods of envy and the gods of revolution that their ancestors served in the distant past, or will they serve the gods of social justice and the gods of intersectionality and the gods of diversity, equity, and inclusion, in whose land you are now currently living. But no matter what you all do, I'm going to go on record right now as saying that me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That is from whom we get our vision. And so, leaders, where's the vision for the individual little people? Who will lay out the plan? Who will be responsible? Who will give away the credit when it succeeds? And who will take the blame if it fails? Who, fundamentally, will carry the boats? The failures of collective Black American leadership are almost now complete. Now it's time, Black leaders, as individuals, to begin to articulate a vision of whom you will serve here at the end of the fourth turning. And well, that's it for me. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.